Hello, and welcome back to another episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod, and today I'm joined by Cris McDavid, Senior Director of Global Clinical Operations at Parexel, and Tashan Mistree, Senior Director of Business Operations in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at GSK. I'm excited to have both a sponsor and a CRO voice joining me today to discuss the new and now final ICH E6 R3 guidelines. Cris and Tashan will take a look at how R3 has impacted the relationship between sponsors and CROs and what opportunities lie within, how sponsors and CROs can push one another, learn from one another, and embrace technology and AI to do so. Ultimately, these partnerships result in more effective and efficient clinical trials with better outcomes for patients. I do want to note that ACRO and TransCelerate teamed up to assist key industry stakeholders in easing challenges associated with operationalizing the requirements of the new R3 guidelines. Our two organizations co-developed a set of adoption tools, frameworks, and templates that are designed to support compliance, data quality, and decision-making. You can find all of these tools by going to the ACRO website, clicking on Initiatives, and selecting Interpreting ICH E6 R3. There are additional tools on the TransCelerate website as well, and we will link to all of these in the show notes. And with that, let's get into the episode. So Cris, Tashan, thanks so much for joining me on today's episode. We're going to be talking about the impacts of ICH E6 R3, one of the hottest topics of the moment, I'd say. I keep hearing about it at every conference I go to. So I'm very happy to have two experts here to walk us through everything. Before we jump into the questions, I just want to note that some of our listeners probably remember that ACRO and TransCelerate have developed a number of tools on implementing R3 for risk management and data governance. And for anyone looking to find those will be in the show notes. So to kick us off, Cris, I wanted to start with you, and then Tashan, please jump in with your perspective as well. But with the ICH E6 R3 guidance now final, can you tell me what the biggest updates are to the new R3?
Yeah, sure. So really, Sophie, in my opinion, in my read and interpretation, it's not so much that these are entirely new concepts being introduced. It's more of an emphasis, if you will, of the expectation that you have quality by design, not only with protocol design, which is generally where everybody's head goes first, but pulling all the way through clinical trial delivery. So when you think about, obviously, your protocol design, but then thinking about your risk assessments and your risk controls and how you inform your functional plans, your data cleaning plans even. So literally from the very beginning all the way through the life cycle of the project and ultimately to, your database lock and maybe submissions, right? The other point that I think sometimes gets a little lost in the conversation is we are obviously today speaking specifically about E6 and R3, but you have E8 and you have E19, and all of this guidance is meant to work in conjunction with each other, be considered in conjunction with each other. These are not standalone guidance documents. And when you really start putting those pieces together, it carries you all the way through your delivery. And I do think that those are two of the main things that I would ask folks to think about as you're going through R3 and the different elements and sections.
So I fully agree with what Cris said. I think I would add to beyond that integration of the QBD principles that are coming from E8 in E6, it is that conduct of clinical trials with a much more pragmatic and innovative approach. And the two areas I wanted to touch on besides QBD are the use of technology. You can see that with the introduction of the new section on data governance and how we need to think about our data, the provenance of our data, the integrity of our data, how it's being collected and how it's being used. So I think E6 gives us much more opportunity to use the technologies out there, whether it's wearables or sensors, and engage with patients in a very different way. And it's also ensuring a lot more inclusion in a wide and diverse patient or participant population that enables us to make sure from a scientific and medical perspective, our clinical trials are really fit for purpose, with the ultimate purpose being getting that medicine or vaccine to a patient.
I love that. And I think that probably as we continue this conversation, we're probably going to talk a little bit more about technology and where technology and the systems play a role in our trial delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tashan, from the sponsor perspective, have you seen any challenges or sticking points in implementing the new guidance? Any anticipated or even unanticipated challenges, maybe?
So I would say from a sponsor perspective, I think it's depending on where you started with the draft guideline. So I can talk from my perspective. We took in our company a very proactive approach, and I think that paid off. We created a lot of awareness when the guideline was just in its draft form, helping people understand what some of those changes were, the new sections especially, and where the thinking was going from the ICH working group, especially in that interpretation of making sure those QBD principles are really coming in from the very start of clinical development all the way through to submission. So we made sure that we had the right framework and ways of working within our company and ensured that, from a process perspective, were there any gaps? Were there any challenges? Did anything need to be updated? And I'm happy to say that proactive approach paid off, and we were able to navigate the change a lot easier. But I still feel the greatest challenge for sponsors is really embedding that quality mindset with the QBD principles so that you are using and thinking of QBD all along the way, and therefore making the E6 guidance a lot more applicable from each and every perspective, whether you're thinking of your data, your monitoring, your risk factors, and that proportionate approach that you have to take requires that critical thinking across the life cycle of a clinical trial.
Yeah, and then Cris, obviously you're at a CRO, so a little bit different than Tashan, but what are you seeing in terms of challenges?
Really, the first thing that comes to mind is not so much a challenge as it is an acknowledgement or recognition that as the CRO partner working with different sponsors, you do need to be aware that these different organizations have a different risk tolerance level within their own organization, and sometimes actually within pockets of those organizations, because you may have different therapeutic areas, you may have different types of trial design, and there are variant risk tolerance levels. And as the CRO, you need to have a real insight and clarity around that, which means that you should be really having a comprehensive conversation with your sponsor to make sure that from the very beginning, you are all facing in the same direction, you're aligned, you understand expectations. And then when you think about how you really apply that quality by design and your risk-based approaches or strategies to conducting the trial and delivering the trial, that you're able to follow that through, and that there are no surprises, if you will, where perhaps we as the CRO think we understand, what the client would be comfortable with or the sponsor would be comfortable with, but there may be a different mindset. So that initial alignment is really key. And that will really help drive success as you start to think about your functional plans, your delivery plans, and the actual conduct of the trial. And then one point that I do want to just hit on for a moment, and would love to hear Tashan's thoughts on this as well, is with this heightened awareness and I'm going to use the word respect, but that's because I'm a little bit of a data nerd. So around the data, right, is this idea of traceability. And I don't think, honestly, I think most of us have always understood you need to be able to trace your data from the point of collection and capture all the way through. But now you see here in the guidance, it's really being surfaced up and called out. And with the technology choices we have today, and vendors and wearables and tablets, different devices, we need to be thinking about our vendor choice and our technology choice with intent, with purpose. What is the true objective? What is the purpose? Who will the end user be? And how do you actually follow that data from the point of capture through the systems? If you're integrating systems and that data is pulling through, maybe there's cleaning and analytics and queries, data may change. And then ultimately, your metadata, right? Those audit trails, the metadata underneath the data needs to be readily accessible. And we have had experiences in the last couple of years or so with all of this new technology coming into our industry where those systems are not actually yet capable of producing things like an audit trail in near real time, or being able to trace that data from point zero all the way through. Now we're seeing a lot of organizations, vendor organizations, technology organizations working and building those functionalities into their systems, but they haven't always been there for everything. And so I think this is something that when you're designing your trial and you're making your choices, you need to be really purposeful and intentional about that.
Yeah, and I think I really like what Cris said about the vendor selection piece, because I think that's so important for sponsors, for CROs, as well as for the investigator. We had the opportunity to engage with sites during our investigator tool development, and there was a lot of discussion around how the vendors or systems can impact the sites, bring challenges as well. So knowing what we want from our vendor in terms of what we're going to do with the data, the purpose of that data, ensuring that we've thought about it throughout, from the start of capture, like Cris said, all the way through that reporting out, the cleaning up of it, how that's going to impact what we submit is really important. And ultimately, it's the sites that are collecting the data on our behalfs, enabling us to have that data to submit. And if we're going to select a system where we're not collecting data that benefits the trial, then we're going to be in a situation where you've wasted resource, time, people as well, their time, patients as well. And I think it always goes back to that mantra that patients are waiting. So we need to be getting it right up front. Again, going back to that QBD part of things as well, and engaging. E8 tells us right from the start that stakeholder engagement is essential for all parties involved. And I think that's something that we really need to challenge ourselves as sponsors to make sure that we're engaging not just within our companies, but with the external stakeholders that really matter to the quality of the trial.
Absolutely. And you both have sort of touched on this and started to talk, I think, a little more broadly about the CRO and sponsor relationship. But I wonder if we could just spend a little more time here. And Tashan, maybe from your perspective first, and then Cris, I'll basically throw the same question to you just on the flip side. Are you seeing any new opportunities in how you work with your CRO partners when you're outsourcing a trial?
I think it's that going back to that opportunity of setting the expectations. It's always been assumed you do that, but I think that different teams do it in very different ways. And you get, people who are very clear, or teams that are very clear on what it needs to be up front, because they've taken that time to process and think about what they're going to need from a CRO relationship and how things are going to work. And then you have sort of the ones who are more focused, I hate to say it, but on accelerating. And sometimes it helps to just slow down up front to be able to get it right in the end. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for how we work with our CRO partners. Again, going back to that engagement piece is so critical. And being on the same page, aligning the expectations, ensuring that we have the right deliverables and the right approach to risk, that proportionate approach to risk, and that we're aligned on it. It means very different things in very different settings to CROs, to sponsors. And so I think it's really working through those parts initially that helps to sustain a good relationship and build a good relationship.
I'm very much in agreement. There's a couple things that I would sort of like to call out. If you think back just a few moments ago, Tashan, you started out a little bit of the conversation talking about the practical approach to trial conduct and delivery. And I do think that with R3, it opens up an opportunity with the CRO and the sponsors in these partnerships for strategic innovation and for building flexibility into the trial design on a practical level. And it's not a case of, hey, don't not do something because of a risk. There's going to be a risk to some degree in almost any circumstance, but it's a matter of assessing that risk and making a decision about is that a risk that you are willing to take on and either minimize or control and manage in some way. And then I do think that there's also the opportunity for us as counterparts to share our practical experience around decentralized modalities that have worked in trials, and those that we have implemented and then course corrected or made a decision that, okay, maybe that's not the best approach, let's make a modification, or learn from just basically lessons learned, right? But we can also learn from each other around vendor and tech usage, because there are a lot of different systems out there, and And there may be a system or a technology that we haven't yet used, but our sponsor has experience with. And so we can benefit from that information. And then effective risk controls, right? And what do we do around ensuring patient safety and data integrity? And another thing that I would say that we know we've already started learning from, not last year, the last several years, is when you think about decentralized modalities and things around direct to patient IMP delivery, but then also the tracking of that IMP and dose administration, things around shipping samples back from patients to labs rather than via a site. And then the evolution of traditional roles. We hear a lot of conversation in the industry and to the effect of roles are changing or roles will be changing. And that's what you hear. Well, roles will be changing. Well, in reality, roles are changing. And we are starting to see this shift from a traditional or classic CRA, if you will, to site relationship managers, and from data managers to data scientists. And those may look and feel a little bit different depending on your organization and where you are in a change curve. But it's all evolution. It's all elevating these individuals and upskilling individuals to continue to really perform at a higher level and in a more flexible trial environment. And I think we can absolutely continue to benefit from what each other's organizations have learned to date.
I love that bit about leveraging the knowledge that CROs have as a sponsor and making sure you challenge the sponsors too, right? If there's a better, faster, more efficient way of doing something, and even if there's a risk proportionate way of doing something, I think there needs to be that challenge to keep each other honest so that we are able to work to these pragmatic guidelines a lot more effectively.
You guys talked a little bit about challenges and opportunities. And so staying on the positive side of things and thinking about benefits. Tashan, if I could ask you to, I don't know if I could only make you pick one, but what do you think would be the biggest benefit for the industry of R3?
At least when engaging with people, what I've heard, there's a lot of interest in that data governance piece because it's really been spelled out. We've got a framework there that helps people understand the, if you like, the application of the principles around data governance, collection of data, and that traceability factor that we've talked about as well. So I think there's a huge benefit there in the guidelines spelling that out. Some of it was assumed previously, like it just made practical sense that you need to have traceable data. But if you ask me, were monitors going in there and tracing the data effectively? I'm not so sure we were trained. I started in monitoring, so I'm not so sure we were trained with that approach 15 years ago. But now it's just obvious, right? That you'd be looking at it centrally. You don't even have to be on site to do that either. So I think there are a lot of benefits within R3. I think the language changing is a huge benefit as well, which allows us to be practical, agile as well. Use that thinking, critical thinking part. Everything doesn't have to be just the way it was before because that's how you did it. Hopefully people have that opportunity to feel safe and challenge the ways of working and the status quo and be able to build on that efficiency that really benefits a CRO or an investigator site as well, and the team that is working on the trial.
And I would just, Sophie, I would like to sort of double down on what Tashan just said there about the language. I think the language of R3 really provides organizations room to work. And so what I mean by that is you have your guidance, you have the expectation around your data governance, and you need to be able to show what you are doing with the data or who is touching the data when, if you will. And you also need to be able to, prove oversight and compliance, whether you're the site or the CRO or even the sponsor. But there is this language around flexibility and these risk-based approaches beyond monitoring. So quite often today, when you hear conversation around RBQM, right, to use the term, it's very focused on site monitoring, or quite often it's focused on site monitoring. And in fact, the risk-based approaches, they can really be applied in other areas. They can be applied in your data cleaning and other spaces. It's focusing on what matters. That's the focus. And the language allows for flexibility, not just in trial design, but also in operations. And then, of course, we haven't really spoken about it around leveraging AI and leveraging large language models and these sorts of things, and how you do that with intent and with intelligence, if you will. I think everyone, depending on who you're listening to, everyone is either really hesitant or reluctant because it's going to take everybody's job. And I don't believe that to be true. I think it's how you use this technology in a really intelligent manner. And then also that you build in parameters and guidelines to guard against things like hallucination or bias or what have you. But the technology is there to help us facilitate our work. And it's just to think about, if you think about data analysis, right? A lot of your AI and other things that we're already using today facilitates data analysis and even facilitates data cleaning or querying, but you still need the individual to be able to tell the story around the data and to really communicate the message to the next person of why you care about what we're seeing in the data and what that actually means for patient outcomes and for the trial. So yeah, I think the language really opens up some possibilities for us.
You're right. Yeah, we probably could do 8 more episodes on AI. And for anyone listening who really wants to listen to more episodes about AI, I think we're doing 3 this season. So they're out there, but we should do one a little more targeted and have you guys back and keep this conversation going. I do want to leave our listeners with a forward-looking sort of set of insights from you guys to close out. Cris, maybe I'll start with you, and then Tashan, I'll have you close for us. But I'm curious just about how you guys see the future state of R3 once the guidance has been fully embraced, whatever that looks like, and the industry is fully evolved to the fullest potential of the guidance. What do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I think realistically speaking, as an industry, we're rather conservative. And so we are not going to see some sort of flip of the switch change overnight. But we are seeing organizations that are already moving toward more progressive operational strategies. And, encompassed in that, as long as those strategies are being driven and informed by quality by design, by focusing on your critical data variables, your critical processes, your patient safety, so your risk-based quality management strategies, you can extend those strategies into data cleaning, into programming, into reporting. I would really like for folks to get comfortable with not treating all data equally. And so really think about where you're investing your time, your energy, your resources. And is that on the critical data variables? Is that on the safety variables? Or are you just spreading that across the collective? So I do think we're going to see a difference in approach there in the future. I don't think the future is next week, but I think it's coming. And really the optimization around decentralized modalities to drive flexibility, but to also drive patient choice, that angle of flexibility. So it's not just flexibility for the sponsor or the CRO or the site, but then for the patients as well. And, Tashan mentioned having the right stakeholders, and that starts with having the right stakeholders in your protocol, in your trial design, and then leveraging AI and agentic AI, because that is a thing, that is a real thing, right? And we should not be afraid of it. We should not fear it. We should become very familiar and learn how to use these tools to further our work and bring the appropriate medications and treatments to the patients in need.
Yeah, I think, it's often said that our AI, our technology, is the worst that it will ever be today. So tomorrow's just going to be better, faster, and there's going to be much more opportunity. And so I think the future state of R3 will really, it's the language that will really help us within the current R3 revision to help us navigate those changes that are coming. I think as Cris pointed out, we're very conservative in embedding and implementing changes within this industry. I think AI is going to force us, and technology will force us to be a little more accelerated in that regard, because if you can't keep up, you're going to get left behind, and you want to maintain that competitive edge as well. I'm not suggesting it's going to be us against AI anytime soon, but I think we need to leverage AI as a tool as well, using the guidance that we have from R3 in being able to ultimately just make those trusted medicines to patients better and faster. We should also think about it from a quality first mindset. I think that idea has been around for a long time. But you can see it's still taking time to embed, whether you're coming from a sponsor end, a site end, or a CRO end. And of course, for the patients, there's that key stakeholder part of the future of all trials is always going to be the participant. And we need to think about the considerations that makes them want to be on your trial, makes them want to take advantage of having that knowledge, of having that care level, of being part of clinical research as well. And so I think there is a lot that we have to do right by the patient, and we need to utilize the guidance to be able to get medicines to patients effectively.
I agree.
Yeah. No, that's a great place to leave off. This was a really great conversation. I want to thank both of you for joining me. I hope our listeners learned something new. I certainly did. And I'm really excited to see where we go with R3 in the future. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of GCP. I hope to see everyone back here next week for episode 8.